Good morning. Welcome to the Baker Institute. On behalf of the Center for Energy Studies and the Mexico Center of the Baker Institute, I welcome you to this interesting event about energy policy in Mexico, the future of energy policy in Mexico. We have a very distinguished guest speaker, Mr. Fluvio Ruiz Alarcón, one of the leading thinkers, leading experts on the oil policy in Mexico, and in particular, one of the most influential voices from the left in the last few decades in Mexico, former board member of Petróleos Mexicanos. Benigna Lais will introduce him in a few minutes, but first I wanted to give you sort of a very brief sort of overview of the importance of what's happening in Mexico. So, as you know, Latin America has the largest hydrocarbons resource base outside of the Middle East. And Mexico, of course, is one of the key countries in terms of the geology in the region. But we have seen in the last few decades very significant changes in oil policy throughout the region. We saw, the privatization period in the 90s. Then we had a period of resource nationalism with different shades of policy. We have seen this model of the independent regulatory agency that sort of in some ways were inspired from the Norwegian model, but that the Brazilians instituted, then the Colombians, and in some ways, with some modifications, the Mexican energy reform took a similar approach. And of course, the Mexican energy reform was one of the most influential events in the oil policy in the region. Today, we see a liberalization process throughout the region that we hadn't seen in many, many decades. Basically, almost every single country is doing some sort of either bidding rounds or, in some cases, specific deals. But almost every single country in the region is searching for international investment in the oil and gas industry. In some cases, bidding rounds were conducted even when the price of oil was very low. So that's an important part of the environment in which we're in. In this context, Andrés Manuel López Obrador wins the election in Mexico by a landslide. He gets 43% of the vote. The next candidate 22%, unprecedented in the competitive period of the Mexican democracy. He gets, and his coalition, a majority in both houses of Congress, and is within reach of the two-thirds majority to change the Constitution of Mexico. So there is no way to understate the magnitude of this political change that we're witnessing in Mexico. And to put it in perspective, it's interesting that, in the rest of Latin America, there was a turn to the left that started in the previous decade, to which two prominent countries were the exception, Colombia and Mexico. And in Colombia recently, Gustavo Petro, got the best result ever that the left has gotten in Colombia. And now we have this very significant victory of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. So we are currently in Latin America is sort of in a transition. Some countries moving from the left to the right, and in the case of Mexico, obviously going in a very different direction. So even though President-elect López Obrador was a very fierce critic of the energy reform when it was approved, we have seen during the campaign much more pragmatism in the way he has approached the issue, but without a doubt, a very different emphasis on what are the priorities. He has talked significantly about reducing the dependence of Mexico from imported natural gas and refined products. He has talked about developing the downstream for strategic reasons and otherwise. And finally, we were joking, he wants to make Pemex great again. So a very big emphasis on the on making Pemex the central driver of policy and investment. So this is going to be a very interesting talk with one of the most influential experts, and so he will deliver a presentation, and then we will have time for question and answers. In some of your seats, you might see a piece of paper for questions. You can start, writing the questions whenever you want, and then if you need a paper, you can raise your hand, and someone will give you a paper. Otherwise, you can also raise your hand with a question so that they can be sent to us. And for presenting Fluvio, we are very happy that Benigna Leis, with a very distinguished career in the oil sector in Latin America, more recently leading Chevron in Mexico, she has become our new non-resident fellow on Latin American energy. She's a friend of Fluvio and was the one who extended the invitation to him. And so we are honored to have Benigna introduce our guest speaker. Thank you very much.
Good morning. It is a pleasure to be here this morning with all of you. I think we have a great opportunity to listen to what this next government is thinking about the energy sector that we are all very much interested in. So I am very happy to have joined the Baker Institute as a non-resident fellow, and very humbled by this opportunity, because I feel that it's a very challenging opportunity to contribute to the discussion in a very interesting region of the world that we are responsible for. So thank you for being here today, and it is a pleasure for me to introduce Fluvio. You can see his CV in the program that is attached. You have it by your chair. But I want to tell you that he has oil in his veins. He was born in Coatzacoalcos, where with his parents, actually, working in Pemex. So he grew up around drilling rigs, around platforms, around wells that were being drilled. So he has known the industry literally from the day he was born. So as you will be hearing from him, he is very passionate about what is happening in this sector. And the industry and Houston has benefited tremendously from the reform that the last government, or the President Peña Nieto did, and the industry has really been very pleased with this energy reform because of the participation. There is no question that the industry has participated very actively, and there had been many years, decades, that the industry was waiting for the sector to open to private investment. So the big question mark, of course, right now is, what is this next government going to do about it? So we are here ready for a real treat to get very close, first-hand voice about what to expect. So let me welcome Fluvio to the podium and to his presentation. Thank you.
Ok, perfecto. Exacto. Well, thank you very much for the presentations. I'm very happy to be here to see some old friends like George Baker and my Sister Sara over there. I was part of the team that wrote the platform, the oil platform of the next government of Mexico. Besides my whole history, personal history, I have also been a member of the Mexican left since I was 14 years old, you know. So these last presidential elections gave us, for the first time, to have a clearly leftist government in Mexico. So we're going to try to make some difference, even though Mexico, in some parts of its history, and it's clear, under the General Lázaro Cárdenas government, it was a left-oriented government. Now it's, for the first time, a clearly left government. So one of the most important challenges we have is, as it was said by Francisco, to put Pemex, make Pemex great again, even if the phrase is not the best one. But I'm going to try to explain you some of the key elements that we're trying to put in place in the next government. What you can see there is certainly the oil production graphic of Mexico, but besides, or if you want, within that graphic, there are several architectural arrangements of the sector. At the beginning, Mexico was like almost every oil country, not ready to manage its own natural resources. So the first part of that, you see this, until the 1920, those were the foreign companies producing the oil in Mexico. There were mostly two important companies, Huasteca Petroleum Company and El Águila Petroleum Company. Huasteca Petroleum is in the northern, worked in the northern part of Mexico, and El Águila in the southern part of Veracruz. What happened is that in 1915, the Mexican state made the first effort to regulate the oil sector. And Presidente Venustiano Carranza created the Comisión Técnica del Petróleo, Petroleum Technical Commission, that was in charge by someone that I think we'll have to give more relevance in Mexican history. He was Pastor Ruiz. He was an engineer. He was the Minister of Economy, and in 1917 he was part of the new Assembly, the Constituent of 1917, and Pastor Ruiz, Luis Cabrera, General Mujica, General Jara Corona, they were the responsibles to write the 27th article of the Constitution. So he's a very important actor at that time. As you know, after 1917, the Mexican state decided to keep all the natural resources underground as nation resources. But there was a difference between the license contracts given by Porfirio Diaz and the new constitutional regime. So what you see as before the first peak that came around 1924 is that the companies decided to keep exploiting the fields they already had, but not to explore anymore because of this law incertitude. And this Mexican state created the oil department within the economy minister in 1919 to keep increasing its knowledge about oil. And finally, in 1935, it was created the first national oil company of Mexico that was named Pemex. It was created to exploit the field of Poza Rica in the northern part of Veracruz, this part that was known as the Faja de Oro, where the most important production came. In 1938, as you know, there was the expropriation of the oil, and then I used to say this to know if there is a generational breach between me and the public. Pemex was born as a Soviet, because all the foreign technicians left Mexico, the English and the American ones. So it were the Mexican workers who managed Pemex as a Soviet, as it was the Soviet Union. That was Pemex, and also the National Railroads. So in 1938, between 1938 and 1940, there's a period called the Workers' Administration of Pemex. And when President Manuel Ávila Camacho came in 1940, he created the new administration of Pemex. And as you can see, between 1940 and the beginning of the 70s, Mexico was a country with oil. George Baker and me, we have a common friend, Ángel de la Vega, that says there's a difference between a country with petroleum and country that sells petroleum and oil country. We were just a country with petroleum. Between 1940 and 1971, the oil sector in Mexico represented less than 1% of the gross national product and less than 10% of the fiscal incomes of the state. But in 1970, and besides, between 1971 and 1973, Mexico became a net importer country. We marginally, but we imported some oil. In 1973, after the shock of the night of that year, as you remember, certainly the price was multiplied by 4 in 1 month. So we started a real oil history. You can see the graphic. There is a huge change in our production because our shallow waters fields became profitable. And the most important was Cantarell. We started to develop Cantarell in those years. So Mexico changed, and our country became a really oil country. And then we had our peak at the beginning of the century. We produced over 3.4 million barrels, and then we started to decline. But the place of Pemex in the economic development model was changed since 1973, and even more since the 1981-82 crisis. Pemex was created as the entity, as the national oil company that had the responsibility to supply the domestic markets of hydrocarbons and refining and petrochemicals. After the 81-82 crisis, and this is very important, Pemex became the most important fiscal source of incomes of the states. And that changes everything, because the hierarchization of investment projects was made in order of this new arrangement. It means, first of all, the state, the Mexican state, still wants to have the fast incomes of selling oil instead of the incomes that can come after the transformation of or the refine. And that's what we want to change in the next government. We want, and maybe this is the most important thing, we want to give Pemex again to allow Pemex to invest in order of the industry logic. It means the long-term industry logic, and not in the short term of the fiscal needs of the state. And that's why we want to start to have, we say, if smarter, of more prudent, maybe the word is not the best one, but we want to administrate in a correct way our resources. One of the things I like to explain when I speak in front of public is, as maybe you know, during the electoral campaign, our elected president, Andrés Manuel, spoke about suspending the contract biddings. Why we're going to suspend? First, and we say it without defined lapse of time. Why? Because first we want to verify that all the processes, all the biddings were made with transparency and without corruption. I think right there won't be any problem. But the most important thing is that we want to learn from the 107 contracts that are already given. We want to learn how, what kind of model, as you know, in Mexico, these 107 contracts are license models, are product sharing contracts, are profit sharing contracts. So we would like to understand what is the best model for the kind of geological complexity that we can bid in the future. Maybe in some cases, it's better to have a license model contract. Maybe in other cases, we can have this product sharing. Maybe in other cases, it's better to let Pemex have an alliance. And that's a very important issue for us. We want to change the law to give Pemex the possibility to choose its ally. The current hydrocarbon law states that Pemex can make a certain kind, in French we say the portrait robot, no? He can say more or less general view of the company that Pemex wants to have as an ally in any case. But is then the National Hydrocarbon Commission with the economic variables put by the Minister of Finance that make a bidding and they decide who is the Pemex ally. No? The example, that's a real example, is Trion, where we had several years of talks with BP, and after the bidding, it was BHP Billiton who became the ally of Pemex. We think that it's better to give Pemex the possibility to choose its own ally, because it will let Pemex and its ally to make a long-term joint venture, for instance, that could go until we can swap assets, we can make technology transfer, we can prepare our engineers to work in other geological complexities. But it's a real synergy we can establish with our ally, and it's better, it's easier if Pemex can choose its ally. It needs a change in the law, but well, as you know, we can do it. So we will try. That's why we say to postpone the farm outs, not because we don't like. it's exactly the opposite. We are convinced that is one of the most important tools that Pemex received from the energy reform with this possibility to share the geological risk, the finance risk, and we want to make it in the way it's made in all over the world. We are also very. We're going to make a very profound exploration effort. The ratio of restitution of reserve has fallen under 20%. It already happened at the beginning of the century, around 2003, 2004. Mexico had a ratio of restitution about 24%. After a very big effort, we got 100% in 2011. So this is very important for us, and also this effort to reduce production costs. You know, Pemex was, I don't want, maybe it's forced is not the best word, but something like that, to produce and to produce and to produce because, as I was saying, the fiscal needs of the state. So the main goal of Pemex was to increase the production besides the production costs. Now we have to focus on production costs. We have to acquire better oil recovery techniques, and we have to go learning in the deep water that is the next border of our country. Maybe the most important objective of the new oil policies is to decrease the energy dependence. Mexico is very dependent, even it's very vulnerable in fuels and natural gas. So that's why we're going to optimize our existing 6 refineries, and that's why also we're going to build at least another one. I was saying to some friends some minutes ago that it's not a matter of business, it's a matter of security. You know, of course, it costs, like I used to say, when you buy house insurance or life insurance. You know, but we need, as a country, to reduce this energy dependence. You know, we have, for instance, we import 70% of our internal consumption of fuels and 92% of natural gas besides Pemex, so outside Pemex. So this is the most important objective of our next government. Of course, to increase the efficiency and security of the product and natural gas chains is something that is very important. And here is a little bit like in Mexico, it's like the United States. You know, the taxation on gasoline consumption is not politically correct, but I think we have to do it. We have to promote the public transportation, and we have to discuss what's the optimal, the socially optimal level of taxation in gasoline. You know, because Mexico, as you know, is a non-equity country. You know, in Mexico, the 10% of the richest own the 64% of the richness of the country. So it's clear that the low taxation of gasoline is a very regressive taxation, so we'll try to review this. even if I have to say it's there's an internal discussion of within the next government. To rationalize the energy consumption is a cultural matter. This is a very long-term objective. It's more. It has to be with the way we approach to the energy consumption, and around it there will be a lot of program. Well, this is maybe I have to confess is something that comes from my heart, is to revalorate the role of Pemex. As almost any national oil company all along the Mexico history, Pemex has played a very important role, not only as a company, but in some stages of our history, Pemex was responsible of the regional development in the places it works. No? For instance, the health system of Pemex was created with Pemex at the beginning of or even before Pemex. Even some oil unions of the companies that were working in Mexico before the nationalization had as one of the most important requests the health system. So we have a health system that was created before the national system, the Seguro Social, before the ISSSTE, no? And also in communications, no? Telecommunication, Pemex is, if our telecom department became a company, it will be the second largest company in Mexico, and in some places the biggest one. After the earthquake of 1985, Mexico City could be connected to the world thanks to the telecom system of Pemex. So you can imagine the importance. But what do I mean, or do we mean when we're talking about to reevaluate Pemex? Is that we think that Pemex should become a real company. Now it works. We are in the middle, sometimes as a company, sometimes as a public entity. For instance, the hydrocarbon law says if we are too competitive, they can order us to stop doing some activities to permit the competence, the concurrence. But they can also order Pemex to make the socially needed projects. No? So there's this ambiguity. We think Pemex should be a real company with, of course, the state regulation, state controlled, but not state limited. And for that, we need to change the composition of the board. As you know, nowadays there are 10 members. There are 5 members of the government, 5 independent members of the board. But within the government members, there is the finance minister, the energy minister, the environment minister, the economy minister. So it's very complicated to have industry decisions when all your regulators are in your board. Transparency and accountability is something that all the Mexican society is asking for. I think it was one of the keys of the election. Even though Pemex has made some efforts, it's clear that we have to go deeper. Pemex belongs to the International Initiative for Extractive Industries. That's a good idea. But anyway, at the end of the history, Pemex is the most important, the largest company of our country. So any effort in transparency and in accountability won't be enough. We'll have to go on. And one very important thing, at least for me, is to boost the research and development in the sector. One of the lacks of the energy reform was to rethink the place of the Mexican Institute of Petroleum in the hydrocarbon sector. We have to strengthen this institute. We have, the institute has 52 years, so it's a creation of the Mexican state that we have to strengthen. We also, in Mexico, the 65% of the oil rent goes to the research. I think we have to improve it at least at 1%. And we have to evaluate the sectoral funds. Maybe you know that there are 3 funds created with this money. That is, one is for the research of the Mexican Petroleum Institute. One goes to CONACYT, to the hydrocarbon fund, and another one to the environment fund. We have to analyze the way they are working. There are good projects that were supported, that were funded with this money. For instance, the Deepwater Center of the IMP in Boca del Rio, Veracruz, that was inaugurated some months ago, and we hope this center will contribute to increase our knowledge in deep water. But we have to make we have to be convinced as a country that after more than 100 years of oil history that you saw in the first slide, we need to be into the oil market, not only because of geological potential, but also because our expertise in some strategic technologies. The relationship with communities is also a very important key point. In order, in the table, of course, the desk, to make easier to develop an energy project, it was stated in the Constitution that the exploration and development activities are of public order and are above all other economic activities. It sounds maybe right in the desk, but it's clear that in our country, the reality shows it's otherwise. I have my friend Nicolas Borda that knows it, because of course, you can imagine if it's not fair enough to impose a project to a community, then to impose a project to a community that had already said no, it's worse. So I think this point is very important. We'll try to make that the answer of the community should be compulsory. There's another lack in this reform is there's no any geopolitical or national security concern. For instance, if we have a transborder field, the law only says, well, Pemex should have 20% of the project. We think Pemex should be the operator besides the percentage it has. And we have to review if it's correct our belonging to the International Energy Agency. We think that a country like Mexico is closer to the OPEC members than to the International Energy Agency members. And finally, besides all this concern about the hydrocarbon sector, as a country, we have to accelerate the energy transition. It's clear that the world is moving forward this energy transition, and our idea is to make Pemex a real an important actor in that sense. It means like other major companies are already making to become Pemex, to make Pemex not only an oil company but also an energy country. So this is our key points, and thank you very much for hearing them. Thank you.
So as I mentioned before, you can pass your questions, and we will start with some of our own questions. I don't know if you want to start, Benigna, or I can.
Fluvio, there has been significant amount of news coming from the government-elect. And it appears that at times there are some mixed messages in terms of the future of the energy reform and the contracts. For example, there was apparently a meeting last weekend with service providers, where in the new, there is going to be an accelerated bidding process. How does that relate to the energy reform and the review of the contracts and the postponement of the bid rounds for blocks?
Well, let's make the difference. The meeting at Villahermosa was about the service providers of the all history time service contracts. There's, let's say, we're going to make this budget effort to reactivate Pemex in the projects that Pemex has been making all the time. So that was the meeting of Villahermosa. On the other hand, there is the review of the biddings of the National Hydrocarbon Commission biddings. No? They are different. No? These are Pemex, only Pemex. No? The kind of projects that Pemex does all the time. No? We want to give more budget. As a matter of fact, 2 weeks ago, I think, Andrés Manuel said we're going to increase the proposed budget. As you know, by law, in July, the board of Pemex sent to the finance minister the proposal of budget. And from this budget, Andrés Manuel said it was going to be increased by $8 billion. So it's almost be doubled. Finally, is the House of Representatives who is going to approve. But so it's in this increase the budget that are going to be these new contact services. But besides, contact services of Pemex. No? That's why.
That would be exclusively the relationship between Pemex and the service providers for projects that have already been defined or will be defined?
Well, one of the exploration programs are well defined. I think there will be, if I'm not wrong, about $2 billion for exploration projects. And the rest are for drilling programs that were delayed and that are part of the minimum program that Pemex was compromised by the assignments, because we have, we talk a little bit later, this morning. Next year, all the assignments that Pemex received in round 0 are about to be finished. So formally, Pemex would have to return to the state the assignments where Pemex didn't have the budget or the capacity to make the works it was concerned. But what is going to happen is the state is going to give Pemex
an extension
of these assignments. So that's why we can announce this almost double budget for the next year.
Okay, thank you. That's good news for the
service
providers.
Service providers, you can give your phone around. That's okay.
We are getting tons of questions already.
Okay.
So I've grouped a few, but basically one very specific is, can you elaborate, and I think this is a concern for many people, on the state concerns about the legality of the contracts that did not have a signing bonus. And the other one is sort of what type of, I mean, the revised process when you renew, awarding contracts. How do you envision it, and do you have a model in the world elsewhere that you think is particularly, interesting to replicate for Mexico?
Yes. Well, about the analysis, we say it's there is no defined time because we have no many specialists in this kind of contracts. But as I was saying, the objective is to review the process of bidding, where we are confident we are not going to find anything, and then to realize what kind of model is better for the country. Maybe after, as I was saying, after 107 contracts, we think we have contracts enough to decide if in the future we're going to bid license or product sharing or profit sharing, depending the field. About the signing bonus, what I can say is it's clear that the companies that, and we're talking about Mexican companies because the license contracts where the state didn't ask for this signing bonus, even though the law says it's compulsory, were the round 1.3 and round 1.4. That these were mature fields, and there were mostly Mexican companies. What I can say, I'm not a lawyer, maybe Nicolas could say something else, but I can say is finally the companies gave or respected what the state asked for. And at the end, it may be some responsibility within the government, because I think someone should notice that the signing bonus was compulsory, and the law doesn't say the amount, and as you know, in the international market are from symbolic ones in Canada to the Libra's bonus signing of more than $3 billion. So if there's a problem, it won't be a problem between the Mexican state and the companies, but within the Mexican government and its officials.
On the same line, what do you think that should happen with the farm outs and different, joint ventures, alliances? What type of contracts are you envisioning in that area?
Well, that is very important. We say we're going to postpone because we want to change the rules. For us, it's very, very important that Pemex can choose its ally. I think it's the joint ventures, the farm outs, will be a very, very important tool of our oil public policy in the next years. We're I hope that we can make these law changes in the next months in order to have more farm outs and joint ventures since next year. But in other bases, that the basis that I talked is Pemex choosing its ally and making a long-term joint venture with the alliance.
What about the possibility of Pemex not being the operator and not having majority?
It will depend. For instance, in deep water, maybe the operator should be the ally. But if we're going to make a joint venture in shallow water, well, Pemex could be. No? That's case by case. But we have all other possibilities.
Well, as you can see, we have here
yes.
dozens of questions. So one that is a recurring question is the role of Pemex in increasing the budget that you have just mentioned and how that increase will be financed.
Well, that is a good question. Yes, because I have to be very clear. It's my personal point of view because my sister says I have this great tendency to be minority wherever I am. So even in the new government, I have my minority. Now, at the end, we'll have to make a fiscal reform in Mexico, a general fiscal reform. In Mexico, the fiscal incomes are 13–14% of the gross national product. The average in Latin America is 20%. In Chile is 30%. In Argentina, 34%. Something. So we need a fiscal change, a great fiscal reform, because otherwise will be depending on the oil income. And even if there is the political will to let Pemex to have more budget to invest, there's a limit if we don't make a fiscal reform. For me, this will be an internal debate the next 2 years. Next year is possible because about all the saving with the savings of the state, there is place to increase the budget as it's been announced. But honestly, I don't think it can be sustainable in the long term if we don't make a fiscal reform.
Yeah, but what is the role of the private investors in that concept of increasing the activity?
Yes, I think we are going to let the private investment to be complementary to Pemex. There are, for instance, in midstream, in stockage and pipelines, all that, there's a great place for the private investment. Also, at gas stations, there are places where for Pemex is very complicated. Also refining, for instance, there could be small refineries for regional markets, such as Cancun. Cancun is the second airport of Mexico. Maybe if you build a refinery to supply Cancun airport, you can do it. So I think there's space. Pemex is going to make a very budgetary effort, but it will never be enough.
There are a few questions on the OPEC issue, asking if there are already, conversations about a role that Pemex might have, Mexico might have in OPEC, and asking what are the benefits for Mexico of either being a member or cooperating with OPEC.
No, it's an open discussion. During all his oil history, Mexico had been middle place between OPEC and the industry countries. Finally, the government, I have to say, without any national debate, decided to go into the International Energy Agency. So there is no fixed position about the membership of Mexico in OPEC or to be closer. It's just an open debate.
Okay.
Yeah, there are also questions about pricing. I think that you got the attention of the audience here about how to price the crude oil as well as the gasoline prices. How do you envision that? Because you made the point that you want PMI to have a significant role. Is that meaning the only one who would be allowed to do the marketing of the oil production, or is one of the players in the market?
No, we think PMI should trade the oil that belongs to the state. No? That is only about production sharing contracts. No? Mm-hmm. So now the law says that the trader is bid. No? And as a matter of fact, it's Trafigura who won the bidding, and Trafigura is going to trade the oil that belongs to the state from the oil production sharing contracts. We think that this oil today is, I think the private production is 8,000 barrels, something like that.
We expect it to grow.
Yeah, we expect it to grow a lot. So in the future, we think that PMI, that is the trader of Pemex, should trade the Mexican oil that belongs to the state, not the state oil, only the state oil. For the rest, of course, the companies
will dispose as they please.
Of course.
And there is a similar question about the gasoline prices.
Well, that's a debate. Yeah. I think it should be a market price. When I say this in Mexico, I start by saying if you were about to like me, I will dislike you. Yes, yes. I think the gasoline should be a market price because we want to optimize our national refinery system. We want to increase it. So, if there's any kind of subsidy, it will become impossible. No? So, I think first there should be a market price. Besides, we have to discuss the taxation level, and I think it has to be a very hard taxation level. More European in that way.
Following up on that, by the way, I'm totally in agreement with you that not only that there should be a significant tax on top of it, but as some of the questions ask is how that will be politically, palatable, and in particular, can there be some compensatory mechanisms? Maybe, like you probably heard about what Iran did of transferring cash to citizens, or other, public transportation subsidies, or something to sort of compensate consumers for the increase.
Yes, I think in this way the idea has been changing from the campaign. Now it seems that we're, at least for next year, we're going to keep this adjustment mechanism. No? That anyway, it costs to the state. Last year, for instance, this adjustment mechanism cost $3.5 billion. To give you an idea, in Mexico, that's the budget of the National University and the National Polytechnic Institute together. So it's something. No? I think we're going to keep next year this adjustment, and then, well, I hope we'll have a more reasonable taxation level.
Yeah, we also have some very interesting questions about your concept of reducing the dependency on the energy sector, particularly on the gas imports. So how are you planning, on one hand, to promote or incentivize the gas production in Mexico by private companies and Pemex. And at the same time, the timing of that, as we know, the production cannot be increased from one day to the next one. So the imports will continue for a while. So what is your view about how to increase the gas production?
We have to make a wide program, but one of the ideas is, of course, it's just an idea. It's not going to solve the problem, but I hope it will help, is to make some fiscal changes in order to the operators, Pemex as well as the private contractors, could produce the gas with cost recovery. So they don't win, they don't lose, and we'll have an increased production that could help to dynamize the rest of the chains, for instance, the petrochemical chain. So finally the state could receive some more taxes from the petrochemical products, the increased petrochemical production, and not at the source. That's one of the ideas. Okay. But we need to establish a wider program because.
So what you're really proposing or considering to propose is to have different fiscal terms.
Yes.
For the gas producers versus the oil producers. Okay.
In that, two questions that are related to that. One is, if you want to promote gas, what about shale? I mean, the president-elect seems to be opposed to the development of shale. So, what do you think is going to happen there? And the other one is sort of economically. You have the cheapest refining here in the U.S. You have the cheapest gas here in the U.S. So, at what cost are you willing to pay for reducing your dependence?
Well, I think at the end, there will be a compromise between our environmental concerns and our energy needs. In what talking about shale gas, we have now we have I have to say, the political limit that all the environmental groups that, of course. And they are okay. These environmental concerns are very strong within the coalition. So I hope that we can have another research project, as we already had, to get more lessons about how to exploit the shale. With all these environmental, social concerns. And what's the price? Well, we know it's not going to be cheaper to make our oil refineries, but as I said, it's a matter of national security. So what's the price of national security? It's hard to say. There are some wars that were made for this kind of concerns.
Sure.
Yeah, there are some questions here about the review of the contracts. The concern is, what are you expecting to look for, and what are you expecting to find in that review that would actually concern, because as we know, there have been 107 contracts already signed. So are you reviewing every single contract, and with what purpose, and because you are looking for something, or what is the point?
The point, let's be honest, the point is that in all discussion of the reform, the new hegemonic blocus, Antonio Gramsci said, was excluded. Not only of the discussion, sorry, but it is a personal history. I stayed 2 weeks in San Lázaro, trying to make some changes. We with the 12 new laws and the 9 that were amended, we're talking about more than 1,000 articles. We made 300 reserves. No one was even discussed. So they say, no, we're not going to discuss. So we were excluded. And then the composition of the National Hydro Commission and the Energy Regulatory Commission was decided between PRI and PAN. So that's, to be honest, that's the source of, let's see what you have done. It's all the point. There's, as I say, the process of bidding is transparent from my point of view. So we're not, I don't think we're not going to find any corruption act. No? And then, as you see, as we also, the contract models were changing since the first round to the last. So we'll see what was the objective of the changes. And finally, as I already said, we will see, okay, in the future, what kind of models is the better for the country. What I can say is that we are going to strictly respect all the contracts that were signed. The only thing that could change our point of view if there were some corruption act, I don't think so. So I must say that these 107 contracts will go on.
Will be fully respected as it is, and you don't foresee that any company is likely to be singled out as a potential
We've been
conflict.
clear. No, Andres Manuel and many companions has already said this 107, only if I insist, I don't see where. So they will be fully respected.
Thank you.
Yes, one very specific question is, will the incoming administration...
My telephone number? No.
Sorry?
My telephone number?
That could be useful for some. Will the incoming administration continue the policies with regard to the tenders of development of strategic underground natural gas storage facilities and capacity? And as sort of a similar, will the new government stand by the permits and plans already approved by the current administration?
Yes. Yes, as you know, in that issue, we really need to improve production, so we'll keep on. Yes.
Sure.
Okay, here there is a generic question which I think is very good in terms of giving us the framework, because it says, can you describe the positive elements of the energy reform that the new government wants to strengthen? What are those positive elements that you see?
Are many. Yeah. I have a friend that told me, and I agree with him, that we're going to face the energy reform not as a boxer, but as a judoka, when you take the impulse, the momentum, and you use it in your favor. Right? Yes, what's in general, the most positive point for me is that the reform clarified the roles of all the actors. Now it's clear the energy minister makes the public policy. You have, we, Pemex, we are the national operator, the national company. We already created industry beyond Pemex, so you need the regulators. I think we have to strengthen the regulators. I think we have to put the ASEA, the environment entity, at the same level of CNH and the CRE. I think that if we really follow the motivation of the energy reform, I mean, to put Pemex as the strongest player, but as a strong player with complementary investment to increase our production. If with these strong regulators, you can keep the state control of the hydrocarbon sector, you can increase the oil rent. I think now we are looking to our research and technical development sector, because now we know it's important. No? We can have a good technology transfer. We can get management expertise. Now in Pemex, we are more interested to go abroad our borders. No, I think those are the positive, just to say. No?
Excellent, thank you.
You mentioned a few things that will require some legislative changes in the secondary laws, but you didn't mention any change in the Constitution. Do you think is there any change required?
The only change, well, there are many Latinos, so maybe you know this Silvio Rodriguez song, si me dijeran pide un deseo, well, besides the rabo de nube, maybe the only constitutional change, and it's not in the body of the reform, is the 8th transitory article, where that states that the oil and development production activities are above any other. Yes. I think it's against our history. I think it's a source of social conflicts, because you can put it in the Constitution, you can put it in the Bible, it doesn't matter. Communities are going to fight for the right. So but it's not in the Constitution as itself, it's a transitory. So that would be the only change. And I'm not sure we're going to do it, but if you ask me, is the only change I could do, because the changes in the Constitution are only few words. They gave us a wider possibilities, no? More possibilities, and you can make more things with this energy reform. The only problem I see in the reform, in the constitutional, is this article. Yes.
Yeah, one last question I have here is on the midstream, thinking about what is the position of the new government regarding the infrastructure of pipelines, storage, facilities. How would you, what would be your position about that, those type of projects?
We're going to promote the investment, private or public, and that's why we need stronger regulators. No? That's why we're saying we need, and when I say stronger, maybe it's not about more law faculties, but about expertise. You know, because we're coming from a history where it was only Pemex. No? So we have to form to get some officials well-formed with a good expertise to make it work in a good way. So that's why I'm thinking when I say stronger.
But what would you envision for the projects that are ongoing? I know that there are some bid rounds on storage capacity, for example, that is supposed to be happening in the near future. So those ones are not going to be affected in any way. They're just going to proceed as they have been
scheduled.
Yes. And I guess a follow-up question there that I'm sure everybody is interested in is how much time is going to take you to do the review, to go from the review to the next bid round on the oil side?
Well, I don't think that it would be no longer that 10 years, no longer that next year. And when we say we, I'm thinking about one person. So, yes, we think it's a matter of some months, but not. I don't think it's going to go beyond next year.
Yeah, because as for the industry, it's critical to have continuity on one hand, and to have the right messages in terms of the corporate processes that all the companies have to put in place to make sure that investment decisions are taken appropriately and at the right time. So if you don't know when it's going to happen, well, you cannot budget for that you don't know when it's going to happen.
Yes, as I say, we cannot say 10 months, 24 days, 4 hours, 55 minutes, but I think no longer at the end of the next year, I hope.
There are questions about Pemex future in terms of should Pemex go abroad if it does, in which type of projects? Could there be like swaps of assets with other companies or other national companies or alliances outside of Mexico?
Yes, I do believe that we should do it. The national oil companies used to supply their countries by internal production and by external production. In Mexico, we didn't have this question because the production was big enough. But now that we are in a declining moment and to increase the production, it will take some time. I think it's very important for Pemex to go abroad, to have some kind of alliance. That's why I insist very much in this law change, so we can assure the domestic consumption. So I think progressively we're going to be more present abroad Mexico.
And what about in downstream, for example, something like Deer Park?
Well, also we have to think, yes.
The other, what experiences around the world do you think inspire you in terms of what could be the future of Pemex? I mean, other companies' examples or some features.
I like Statoil. I like the Norway example. I also like Petrobras. Besides the problems, I think they made a good effort. But if I can tell one national oil company, is Statoil.
Well, there's one sort of very specific one. The last one I have is how are the plans and how to compensate Pemex for the areas that they didn't keep in round zero?
Well, I had a dinner with my friend Gerardo Esquivel, and I put him the problem because there are many ways, because the transitory doesn't say how they have to compensate. Maybe it can be by reducing. Pemex pay taxes each month, each month. So maybe they can reduce the tax that Pemex pay to arrive to this. We're talking about $3.5 billion.
Okay.
So maybe in abonos chiquitos.
In a reduction of the payment.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you. No, I have covered most of the questions.
Yeah, we are. Me too. So.
Yes.
So I guess we are reached the end. We have been squeezing you with question after question, but thank you very much
thank you.
Thank you. Answering all these questions and coming to Houston. And so I hope this is the first of many visits here. And so thank you very much. And
thank
please,
you.